So I hope, like you've enjoyed our conference. VetsinTech Invasion is a great place to learn and share ideas and really benefit from a lot of people's experiences. And I am honored to get a chance to benefit from the experience of Steve Blank. If you've had a chance to click in through Steve's biography, you know it's pretty powerful. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But I think it would be helpful to me highlight a few things. And, I will probably, Steve, go on a bit too long, but it's such a great honor to have you here. Many of our team members know that you're a veteran of the Vietnam War, and you repaired fighter planes in Thailand during that time, and landed in Silicon Valley in 1978. Since then, you've come to really personify what we think of as a serial entrepreneur, founding or co-founding 8 companies across numerous facets of the technology landscape, including Epiphany, which many of us have heard of as one of the pioneers of personalized marketing, 2 semiconductor companies, Convergent Technologies in the workstation space, Ardent, Supermac, ESL, and Rocket Science Games. And those are just the companies that you've been part of as startups. It's pretty phenomenal. You're also now a frequent author in entrepreneurship, and you're teaching positions at Stanford, Berkeley, NYU, Columbia, USF, Imperial College, and I've probably missed 1 or 2. And now we're going to get a chance to have you here. I really love the fact that we're going to get a chance to talk about your Lean Launchpad, which you really become part of the curriculum at many universities. And it's online, where you've reached 500,000 aspiring entrepreneurs. So you got a list of accomplishments and awards that are too numerous to mention, but my favorite is a Master of Innovation by Harvard Business Review. So I think that's a really great way to start. You've changed how startups are built. You've influenced how entrepreneurship is taught and how science is commercialized. And now you're really engaged in how companies and the government can innovate together. So I'm pretty delighted to welcome you here, Steve. It's great to have you sharing your professional journey and your insights, and teaching so many people to think differently about innovation. But a lot of us really don't know your personal journey, and it's the first I really understood about your time during the Vietnam War. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about that time, and be willing to talk about that time in history and the impact that your service had on you then, as you continue to look back on it now.
So thanks, Dan. It sounds like one heck of a planned career rather than a series of disconnected accidents. You at least for me, you could never plan looking forward, but looking back, you kind of see how the dots kind of connected. And during Vietnam, it was the first time I actually did service, though that has been part of my career, which I'll talk about in different ways. I joined up when I was 18. I dropped out of college for lots of reasons, mostly because I couldn't see why I was there, and hitchhiked around the country, and eventually signed up for the Air Force. I missed the Navy because I couldn't swim, and decided that the armies and Marines were slogging through the jungle and doing the pointy end of the spear. And just to be clear, I mean, I was 200 miles away from the fight. The bases were shelled a couple of times, but nothing like, people, walking trails every day. But as anybody in the service knows, at a very young age, you learn how to deal with chaos and uncertainty, and in a war zone, even more so. You learn how to deal with massive organizations that theoretically have lots of rules and constraints, but again, in a war zone, those kind of disappear, and you tend to focus on the mission. And that was kind of the first time where, at a very young age, I learned that if you excel and you're focused on the mission and you deliver for mission, you could get responsibility way past your age, pay grade, or anything else. And that was the first time I got to manage people. By the time I got home, I was managing 15 people at 19 years old.
Wow.
Not a while. I mean, it's what people did at the time. And that kind of did me in good stead when I got back to Silicon Valley. I joined my first startup, which was actually a halfway house between my military career and an entrepreneur career. It was a company run by a PhD mathematician who would eventually become the Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry. And by sheer accident, ended up in one of the programs, which was their company's largest, which was back then called the National Means of Technical Verification through Overhead Assets. and ended up being the instructor for that program. And then I guess I was about 22 years old. And part of my career has been sticking out your thumb and seeing where it takes you, number one. And two is violating a basic military tenet, which says you never volunteer for anything. But instead, even through my military career and the rest of my life, I have to tell you, I benefited for volunteering for everything and showing up more than most people. And for those of you in the military, you volunteer for everything. You end up doing, kitchen duty and shoveling latrines and whatever, which I did my share of. But every once in a while, you get like on some program where you're just the only person who volunteered. And that happened enough times that became a kind of integral part of not only my military, but my civilian career is show up, have an opinion, share what you've learned. And often than not, if you're able to articulate an idea or take a leadership position, other people will follow. So I don't know if that was your question.
That's a phenomenal way to answer a couple of key things, and I love it. And first, I do want to thank you because you did step up to serve, and you diminished that, and most of our attendees, whether they're family members or veterans, made that decision and raised their hand to step up and do something larger themselves. And yeah, we joke about, right, don't volunteer for anything. Everybody probably viewing this has volunteered for something and takes that to heart. As I talk to veterans who are making the transition, and VetsinTech is key to part of that, I always say all the best career planning is done in the rearview mirror. But it starts with doing the best job you can and determining how to serve.
So Dan, let me just follow up on that, just one thought. And everybody listening has been part of this, but you're in the middle of Silicon Valley or entrepreneurship or capitalism, whatever. And I got to tell you, it's great making money. It's, what a great time to be in the middle of an economic environment that's booming and going to boom bigger. But I have to believe, and a lot of civilians will never get this experience, is that it really isn't a fulfilled life until you serve, whether you do national service or public service or serve your country, your family, your community, etc. And I've tried to live that life, and I try to suggest to my students and everyone else who are out doing, who haven't served, who are doing startups and whatever, that at some point in your life, you want to look back and say, well, what else have you done for the people around you or the country around you or anything else? And again, I have to tell you, the first time I heard thank you for your service was 30 years after I served, and it was nice that the country finally caught up to it. But remember, service encompasses a lot of things. It could be public service, working for an NGO or nonprofit, etc. But I think all of us who have served ought to make sure we encourage any type of service in people we meet. That it doesn't have to be to join the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, etc. That it could be working for an NGO or a nonprofit, or it could be giving your time back in your community or to God or something else. All those make us better, both citizens and human beings. And I think we should, again, in looking back about the piece of service we did, think that it's part of something bigger.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And it's important for all us veterans to recognize that the model we followed or the service we did is not the only way to serve. And whether you're on a mission trip, right, or whatever you serve to do as a first responder, as a volunteer in your community, I think your life is definitely richer for that. We're lucky that we shared that our lives were richer because of that, but it helps you bring new perspective. And I want to kind of get back to, we're here talking about technology, because one of the places you brought incredible perspective and a way you continue to serve was what you brought to Silicon Valley. When you came, the Silicon Valley names, were Hewlett Packard and Intel and Tandem. And you actually have, I encourage everybody to go to SlideShare and check out your 278-page SlideShare presentation about how Silicon Valley really didn't just go from orange trees to semiconductors. It starts with radar and defense technologies. But you helped change a lot of the thinking, right, in Silicon Valley. Where did you see cracks in the model, and what needed to be rethought as you really landed on the ideas of the lean startup and rapid innovation?
Well, it took a bunch of painful years as an entrepreneur. My first career was, after I landed at my halfway house, which I mentioned, I did 8 startups in 21 years. Box score at the end was 4 IPOs, but 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. And actually, it was out of the failures that a couple of things came clear. And by the way, and I think it's true. When you're doing a startup or you're CEO of a major corporation like you are, Dan, your head is down in execution. The ability for you to think big thoughts and read a ton of literature and whatever about lots of things are kind of limited because you're operating for survival. But when I retired, I had time to think about what had occurred not only in my career, but I was now sitting on public boards and private boards and realized there was a pattern here. And the pattern was pretty simple, is that investors for the first 25 years of Silicon Valley essentially told startups, well, I don't think they ever said these exact words, but what they were saying implicitly were, startups, you're nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. So everything a large company does, we want you to do. Because honestly, we're VCs, we don't know any better. So that we write checks, we're kind of taking risks, but we're not thinking big thoughts. We're thinking, large companies write business plans. We want you to write a business plan. Large companies, do a 5-year forecast and tell us it's going to be $100 million in revenue in 5 years. That's what we want you to say and tell us how you're going to get there. Not unreasonable, but we'll tell you why it's unreasonable in a second. The large companies hire sales, marketing, and biz dev and engineering on day one and have an org structure. We want you to have that exact same org structure. And just to be sure, large companies spec the entire product on day one, every feature. And we want you to take your vision, turn it into a functional spec, hire engineering, use waterfall development, that is serial development. And obviously, what will come out of the end in a year or two will be a finished product that hopefully our building's big enough to hold the bags of money that will inevitably come. Believe it or not, that was the 20th century investor model. And not to be fair, it worked well enough that VCs weren't looking for another model because this one was printing cash for them. Now, as an outsider now, or an insider with an outside view, finally in retirement, I had the space to say, well, wait a minute. Large companies execute known business models, which is a fancy word for saying eventually when you get large, you have discovered who are your customers, what features they want, et cetera, who your competitors are, what pricing, what channel, et cetera. And it doesn't mean you're not innovating at the edges, but 99% of your people who come into work are to run that execution machine. There are product manuals, there are HR manuals, there's HR job descriptions. And so large companies are executing. But startups, they might think they're executing, but they're actually doing something very different. They're searching for a business model. And this distinction between search and execution had never been made before. And the consequence is really important. For execution, business schools and management consulting firms had built 150 years of organizational tools and HR tools and strategy and whatever, but no one had done anything about innovation for startups. Because if you said it was nothing more than what companies did, you were supposed to read the same books or use the same processes. And none of them really worked. I mean, every founder knew that no business plan survived first contact with customers. Riffing off of von Moltke, right? It's like no war plan survived first contact with the enemy. Same thing was here. You wrote it to get funded and then you threw it in the desk. Because the minute you ran into customers, everything didn't work anymore. So this was a long soliloquy to tell you the background of why lean. And so I realized we needed our own tools and methodology to match the management stack that large companies had. And lean basically should I stop or keep going, Dan?
You should keep going, but I just want to get my favorite quote of yours where you talked about VCs requiring 5-year plans, and you said the only other organization that requires 5-year plans is the Soviet Union.
And now China.
Why do we drive that? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was my Cold War quote. But so I realized that, okay, if we're searching for business models, what would tools for search be versus execution? And the lean methodology just has 3 components. One called customer development, the other called agile engineering, the third called business model design. And I'll briefly describe the 3. The first part says, well, wait a minute. If we're searching for a business model, why are we spending the time arguing with each other in a conference room? The big insight about startups are there are no facts inside the building, so get the hell outside. That's a huge idea, is that all you have on day one is an untested series of hypotheses, which is a very polite business school way to say you're just effing guessing. about most of the things around your business model. You're guessing who your customers are. You're guessing what features people might care about. And this combination of features and customers are called product market fit when you finally find it. And so I developed a methodology that is a process of how to get out of the building and not just stand in your parking lot, but who you should talk to, what you should ask them, what you're trying to learn. And then one of my students, Eric Reese, observed that, Steve, in the 21st century, at least for software, we were no longer using waterfall. We were using a methodology called Agile. Right. And Agile development allows you to build products or services incrementally and iteratively, which allows you to get out and test them a piece at a time rather than just building the whole product and then vomiting it outside to a VP of sales and sales organization and say, sell it. It allows you to get feedback all the way into the process and all the way back as a continuous process. And then the third part is, well, what should we be testing outside the building? Alexander Osterwalder came up with a single piece of paper called the Business Model Canvas that has about 80-90% of the questions you want to answer in this startup CEO or founding team. Who are the customers? What are the value propositions? Meaning, what are you building for them? How do you reach them? What's your channel? How do you get them, keep them, and grow them? What's the revenue model? What are the strategic activities you should be doing? How many of those activities do you need to own internally? And which can you partner outside? And what are the costs? Boy, those are great questions. But now these three pieces make up a kind of a first management stack, a tool for startups to now think that there's a method to building startups rather than just let's throw stuff at the wall, build it, ship it, and see if customers buy.
We don't need to operate in stealth mode and keep things secret. We don't need to wait till we have everything put together and think of this idea. So you talked about experimentation instead of elaborate planning, and
right.
Customer feedback versus intuition that this is going to be a big thing, and that design up front, right. Minimal viable products. I love all that. Now we think that's common sense.
Right.
And I tell my team, of course, that
it should have been common sense, from the beginning.
But it wasn't, right?
It wasn't.
And so, what was it like? I mean, you were essentially a radical. You were taking on, these thinkings, and what was that like? How did you do it, and when did companies start to really take notice? Where was the tipping point?
It's very funny you asked, because I was just I was just interviewed by somebody with this question. And I haven't thought about it for a long time. And I realized when I was answering the question how emotional I got, because I still remember, number one, I thought this was so obvious. Let me take it to the VCs on Sand Hill Road and say, hey, guys, there's a much more efficient way for, and basically I got patted on the head that said, well, that's nice, but we're making a lot of money. Why should we do anything different? Or this would require us to kind of, change what we ask at board meetings. Now we know how to look at an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. So why would we have to ask about, customers and what you learned and discovery? It required a whole new vocabulary and thought process. And remember, back then, most VCs were not entrepreneurs. They were finance people or MBAs. And so they were very comfortable with looking at income statements every board meeting. Now, the joke was I used to be that CEO reporting my income statement said 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 until some revenue showed up. But they were happy because I was showing them the paperwork. So the next group I went to is, well, obviously the VCs aren't innovators, at least they weren't at the time. Let me go to the business schools, one on the West Coast who will become nameless, right in Silicon Valley, and one on the East Coast who will become nameless, those starts with an H, and who are the thought leaders, and let me share this idea with them. And of course, I still remember the answer from someone who's still there at unnamed school who double patted me on the head and said, Steve, I consult for companies that have hundreds of thousands of people. How hard can 5 guys in a garage be? And now remember, this is before it was cool for professors to consult for startups. They would make their money because, and they still do, but now startups are within their purview. But back then, that was not considered a place to make money or get rich. And I realized I'm talking to 2 groups, which are the null set for adoption. But, God bless Eric Reese, became the Johnny Appleseed of proselytizing, and his experience, he became the first practitioner. Eric doubled the total available market from 1 to 2 when he adopted the process. And then I got invited to teach this as a class at UC Berkeley in the business school. In spite of naysayers, Jerry Engel, who ran the entrepreneurship department there, said, this is pretty interesting. Why don't we try this as an idea? And then all of a sudden, when the bubble collapsed in Silicon Valley in 2001, VCs were hiding under their desk, and any money that was flowing out for startups were looking for startups that weren't throwing dollars down the drain, but it could be incredibly efficient with time, resources, money, etc. And lean really referred in one part to the process, but the other is by design. The process says infinite capital doesn't work. Why don't we just make sure that when we aim for the target, we're kind of directionally correct before we pile on cash? And so the model got adopted in the rubble of the first .com crash. Right. Does that make sense for?
It totally does. And, this is an interesting aspect. And when I do a lot of talk with our veterans who are looking to transition to technology, I say, you want to come work in IT? And, yes. And I said, well, the two most important things that your experience as a veteran or as a family member supporting a veteran is integrity and teamwork. And this idea that, right, the 5-year business plan, no one ever believed it. It just checked the box for the VC. And instead, the lean startup brings this idea, I'm going to be honest that I don't know the answer. And I'm going to do lots of iterative planning versus a big plan and try to deceive you. And I'm also going to do it as a team. I'm going to engage with my customers, get their feedback. I'm going to iteratively learn. And so this thing we talk about of, what I believe veterans learn that they can bring is exactly what you exemplified as you did this. Now, the final piece, which may be an overused word, is resiliency. You took the feedback, you learned, you changed path. And, part of the narrative is absolutely, you were steadfast and had the idea, but you learned from each of those professors. And
you bet.
Continue to, change the model, which I think is great.
We do use this word resiliency, but it's also tenacity.
Yeah.
And this ability to embrace, and people use this word about lean as it's all about failing fast. That's bullshit. No one wants to fail fast. What you want to do is learn fast. And if you learn fast, then things won't work all the time, and failure will be an integral part of rapid learning. But if your goal is to fail, I don't want you on my team. It's not the goal. But in fact, the best public example of this in a large corporation, public, is SpaceX designing Starship. And there's an A/B test. There's NASA designing the Space Launch System, which is kind of a Saturn V rocket, which has never left the pad and finally fired up after maybe 10 years of Boeing working it, and they're by, getting everything right and doing all the right experiments and simulation. And SpaceX is shooting stuff in the air and kind of, okay, what did we learn from the last experiment? And a lot of times it goes boom. And it's really interesting about which method is the right one. Or maybe the better comparison is SpaceX versus Blue Origin. One is still kind of, building facilities in Florida, and the other has put up 1,400 satellites with Starlink, and at the same time launched, manned crews to the space station. So I think we've seen a public example of, this only works in startups. No, it actually works in large corporations as well, and will work. And in fact, if we really think about it, it works in the DoD that we haven't even told ourselves it did. Every service has the equivalent of a rapid capabilities organization without acknowledging that they're bypassing the entire existing, PPE and acquisition system. And they also are using OTAs, other transaction authorities, to also bypass the existing acquisition system.
Well, that's what I think is so fun about this cycle is, right? Once upon a time, startups took their lessons from the way big companies ran. And now big companies are taking their lessons from startups and what you did with Lean Launchpad and how you've taught to iterate in the way, for example, that SpaceX is doing. Right. And it really goes into some of your new initiatives, which I love, the hacking initiatives. You began with life sciences. Now an area that I know our audience is going to care about is hacking for defense. And there's always been, as you said, a strong relationship between defense industries, the women and men of our armed forces. But you've really helped drive some tech-driven innovation that begin to be major game changers. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about how this is, to use a Calvin and Hobbes term, transmogrified, right, into hacking for defense and your hacking initiatives.
Yeah, well, we're playing Calvin ball. We're making up rules as we go to take the Calvin analogies out. But so just for everybody who's watching, hacking for defense is basically a class in right now 50 universities run by the Defense Innovation Unit. But it started at Stanford. We started the class, and here's the origin story. I talked about lean and how it was a process and lots of books and lots of whatever got adopted by startups and then large companies. But there still was no class that taught it. The capstone or top class in any university up to 2010 was still how to write a business plan, even though we all kind of knew that wasn't very useful. So I decided to start a new class based on lean, which said, no, I'm not going to teach you how to write a plan. I'm going to teach you how to get out of the building, build minimum viable products, talk to 100 customers in 10 weeks inside a classroom. But you won't be in the classroom. We're going to make you get outside the classroom. So anyway, I start this new class, and I decide to blog every week of the class for anybody who cared to read it, not knowing if anybody would. Long story short, the National Science Foundation looks at the class and decides they're going to insert it into their SBIR SIBR program and make it required. If you want a grant from the National Science Foundation and you're a principal investigator or scientist in the US, you now have to take the class. It's called I-Corps. So the NSF took my Stanford class, renamed it. I taught the first two classes, trained the educators, wrote the educator's guide. It's now in 100 universities. We put 5,000 teams through the program. And then the NIH and two directorates adopted it as well.
I just like how this was all part of your master plan and it's all come together.
Yeah, listen, because I was a marketeer, my strategy is you shoot the arrows and then you paint the targets around them. That's how you look like this was very thoughtful. But that's the setup to Hacking for Defense. As I said earlier in the conversation, I've always had this notion of service. And to be honest, I think the country made a major mistake when we ended any form of national service during the Vietnam War. We disconnected the body populace from any skin in the game. It's why we have 20 years in Afghanistan. You can make your own checklist, but that's my personal belief. And here I was teaching at Stanford, and I have students who didn't even know what the DoD was, and their careers were going to get them into Facebook and Google or whatever the hot startup of the week was. And if you even try to engage them in a conversation about the DoD, those who weren't already on that path kind of looked down at their nose and thought everybody was a bunch of idiots or baby killers or take your checklist. And then post-Snowden, it got even worse as the DoD kind of stuck their head in the sand and rather than engaging in the valley, disengaged. That was the situation as I found it, and thought we were making a major mistake, missing a major opportunity. And I was brainstorming with two ex-Army colonels. Pete Newell, who ran the Rapid Equipping Force, just stood up a company called BMMT. And so Pete had been deploying rapid innovation to the battlefield, probably holds the record for most things taken out of labs and put into people's hands, commercial or government. And then Colonel Joe Felter, who was a Special Forces operator, taught at West Point, now at Stanford. And by the way, he took a detour as the Deputy SecDef for South and Southeast Asia. But we were brainstorming about how could we get students more engaged in national service. And we realized we could take my exact I-Corps Lean Launchpad class, but this time instead of students or scientists coming in with their own ideas and problems, why don't we go out to the DoD and intelligence community and solicit problems from them, and then offer the students a set of problems to pick from to work on that were some of the toughest problems the country had. And, it was a science experiment. Will this work, et cetera? But we knew the framework would work because it was already deployed. It was whether this concept of working on specific problems that weren't your own. And as I said, the punchline is it's now in 50 plus universities, scaled way past Stanford, obviously, lots of smart people teaching it, managed by DIU and National Security Innovation Network, Ensign, with lots of people in lots of universities. And graduating, I think, something like 1,000 students a year now working on, lots of DoD problems. And it's one more contribution to national service, right? There are Defense Digital Service and other things that kind of helps allow civilians to help. Personally, I believe we need some form of mandatory national or public service, not a draft, but getting the country aligned again. Given where we are is how separate we've all kind of, and social media has gotten us into our own echo chambers. Social media was obviously designed to bring us together, and it ended up for profit and political motives to tear us apart. And so we need some kind of unifying force for the country. hacking for defense is our small contribution.
Well, it's not a small contribution. It's a very meaningful one. And I encourage anyone, after our keynote session here is over, to go search about hacking for defense. There's some great highlights on the Stanford webpage. Duke is one I spent some time on. And there are great projects that are all highlighted that were raised within either Department of Defense or intelligence agencies that students have worked on in a really rigorous program. So I would love to hear maybe a couple highlights of some of the team's presentations or projects which you think have the highest potential for making a difference. Could you share one or two stories? Because they're really fun to go read online.
Well, the first year it was all a science experiment for us. It's like, this is a hypothesis that it would work. We knew the framework would work, but would any ideas come out of it? And one of the first classes, there was a team came in with this crazy idea. You got to remember this 5 years ago about building something a CubeSat size that would have a synthetic aperture radar on it, and launching a fleet of those into space, which back then was kind of insane. Of course, that was called Capella Space. And for those of you who know, they got a seed round the day they ended the class. They got $40 million of venture investment, and they've launched on top of Falcon 9s, and they're in space. And now they're one of many synthetic aperture radar companies that, we used to have unclassified imaging commercial stuff, but SAR was still kind of the synthetic aperture radar was still kind of the domain of the military, that is being able to use radar to see through clouds or overcast or whatever. That's now kind of another commercial thing you could buy for a service. And so that started in the class. And, one of the first things they discovered is, not only should NGA or NRO be a customer, but just tracking illegal fishing, whether it's off the coast of Africa or whether it's in the South China Sea, was a great activity. When those fishing fleets turn off their transponders, there's still a way to visibly track them, rain or shine or night or day. The other thing which kind of illustrated the class, there were two examples I love, actually three, and I'll try to be brief. One was a team that got a problem from one of the SEAL teams that were using the underwater transit vehicles. At least back then, I don't know if it's true now. Their vehicles had to be within a certain distance of the surface to geolocate with a GPS boom, and it seemed pretty obvious to both the teams and any technologist that, well, gosh, that you kind of exposes you when the closer you are to the surface. Is there any way to kind of have a GPS signal if you were deeper? And so they gave that problem to the team, and there were lots of ideas came. But the first thing is that none of these students even knew what the SEALs were. And within four weeks, by their own, they volunteered for this. They all trained as divers, and they all got certified as divers. And within 6 weeks, they were building CO2 propelled GPS buoys in the Stanford swimming pool that they built on 3D printers and CNC machines. And by week 10, they were out in a SEAL deployment vehicle testing this thing out in an unnamed place. And that was in 10 weeks of students who never heard of a SEAL. There was another team that, and this might play to your experience in Iraq, is there was a team that was helping the Army transition their explosive ordnance disposal team knowledge to the Iraqi Army. Right. Well, here again, these teams didn't even know what EOD stood for on week 1. And they came in the second week pontificating about EOD and whatever. I said, have any of you worn EOD gear? Do you even know what it's like? Do you know what it's like to try to move wearing all that stuff? Oh, yes, then we'll have them do X and Y. I said, don't come back to the class until you have. And they're going, we're in Silicon Valley. Well, I happen to know, or maybe it was Pete who knew, there was an FBI EOD training in Oakland. And then next week, they came in the class with videos of them fully up armored with EOD body armor and wearing whatever, going through the class, saying, okay, we think we understand a little bit, like 2% of what's going on here. And then I'll use the last example, again, another SEAL example, because we have a good relationship with them as well as other parts of the services and combatant commands, is Navy SEALs go through training called BUDS training down Southern California, and the instructors were trying to figure out how do they translate some of their qualitative assessments into something maybe a little more quantitative, and to automate some of the things they were taking notes of the trainees. And again, this was a team that was pontificating, well, maybe here's a software, because Stanford students want to jump to these solutions like everybody else. Here's the software we could do. And you don't have a clue. We want to see you in bus training. And literally 2 weeks later, we have photos of them coming out of the ocean swim dressed in khakis. Obviously, they didn't go through the whole course, but they went through 2 days of the partial BUDS training. And then and then we believe they understood a little closer. Just imagine if every DoD requirements writer was forced
how to do that. Right? Well, you come back putting yourself in the shoes of the shoes of your customer, right? How do I think about that? Be immersed in that. And look, as the CEO of TIBCO Software, we've worked really hard to build our culture of innovation, and that's a heritage of ours, and it's actually one of our 5 core values. And it comes back to exactly what you did. Focus on customers, listen, share, be passionate about it, put on the EOD suit, spend a day in their life, be faster, more agile, right? Find our lane and recognize what really makes a difference for us. In the same way a startup goes to look to find and validate that their hypothesis works, we try to do that every day with our customers. And so, yes, it's all around the lean startup, but I think lean organizations who drive and thrive on innovation are going to be key. And clearly that collaborative, whether that's a private-public partnership, like you talked about, which is really valuable and I think important, but this idea of being together, of understanding each other's shared experiences. And in today's day and age, each individual is going to bring a unique perspective that helps solve the broader problem together. And I love that you've done that with Hacking for Defense and all your other, hacking initiatives. I really want to now close with, kind of the final thoughts for our team members here who are thinking about their journey of lifetime learning and staying connected. So how do you recommend a veteran who is attending this session, who might be doing their initial training and understanding what their next job would be, to make their personal journey as impactful as yours, or even a fraction of the impact of yours?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I could spot a veteran a mile away now, at least in a classroom. I mean, they stand differently. They look at different things. It's just, you've had a whole different world experience than someone who's spent, a couple of years in a frat, drinking or doing whatever. And I mean, you've had your own kind of fun, but at the end, particularly for those who've been in a combat zone in any close proximity, life took on a very different view than people who didn't. For me, coming into Silicon Valley, I still remember doing the first or second startup, having a roommate telling me, boy, don't you understand how risky these things are? Like, you could lose your job. And I remember either thinking or saying, well, I was just in a place where others could lose their lives. And so nothing looked as dangerous to me as the place I left. It's kind of hard to starve to death in the United States. You got to work at it. You probably could, but the risks are much different than the lives you just left. And yet you left with a set of skills that 99% of the country don't have. You know how to deal with large organizations. You know how to separate the trivial from the crucially important when it matters. You know how to operate in chaos and uncertainty. You know how to operate within and around hierarchical organizations that are ostensibly command and control in peacetime and will flatten in crisis. Those are great skills. And if you had an MOS that gave you a particular technical skill, you also worked on things that mattered. Keeping your FARD app up is one thing, but keeping a communication link up the battlefield is something else, right? I mean, so I just think in hindsight, I think my experience was definitely not unique. Had a unique advantage over everyone else who didn't serve. I just saw things differently. I valued things differently. I had, as I said, organizational skills that people didn't have. And I think service people today have all those advantages and more. And the biggest advantage, and I feel a little wistful and grateful that now the country honors its service people. When I came back, from Southeast Asia, the first thing you did was take off your uniform. It was a society that it's hard to remember that, but the society, didn't appreciate those that had served.
Steve,
Nowadays,
when I was reactivated and spent a year in the middle of my technology career back serving in Iraq, and we came back through the airport, and the line was 200 people long welcoming us back. The majority of them were Vietnam era veterans. And so I'm grateful to you for all you've done. I'm grateful for what you shared with us today. I'm sorry I didn't intend to do this one, but it really is meaningful. And I'm glad that our country recognizes that and recognizes not only what you've done recently, but what you've done throughout your career. I think it's a great chance for all of us to apply those lessons. And thanks for this incredible conversation. Your commitment to veterans, their lifelong growth, success, innovation. This is a great way to top off our VetsinTech Invasion. And I'm really grateful to spend the day with you today, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Dan.